If you have not seen part 1 of this story yet, stop right here and go watch it first.
I love you.
I have pinned the link in the comments below.
You're doing great.
You need to know what
feel
happened
it.
at that
One
altar
more step.
and what happened
That's the
afterward at that
spirit.
lake cabin for
Team,
this
let's get
next
these
part to
frames
hit
up.
the way
Safety
it should.
first.
Blueprints show the
Go
ramp
watch it
specs
now
here.
and then come
Perfect, let's
back,
build it
because
right.
what you are
My
about to
journey was
hear
filled with
changes everything you think
obstacles,
you
but I turned
already
my pain
understand
into
about
power,
Benedict,
and
about
now I am
Ruby, and
unstoppable.
about the woman who walked away
Oh my
from
God,
both of them.
Benedict, we're pregnant.
For
I
those
can't
of you
believe
who
it, Ruby.
already
We're going
know
to be
how this
parents.
story
I love
began,
you so
welcome
much.
back.
Our beautiful
Let us
Abigail.
continue.
I love you.
Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us get into it.
I made so many
Thank you all
mistakes,
for helping me
Benedict.
hit
I never
1,000
meant to
subscribers
hurt
and for
you.
proving my
Please
friends
forgive
wrong.
me.
Now let's hit 2,000 subscribers, my beautiful family. Subscribe to this channel if you are new to this channel. Subscribe right
Can't do
now.
this anymore tonight.
Subscribe now. Now let us get into it. 18 months after the quiet wedding on the porch of that lake cabin, Benedict Washington and Ruby Lawson were living a life that neither of them had planned for, and both of them had come to treasure more than the lives they had originally imagined. Benedict's mobility had continued its slow, uneven
feels
improvement.
It does.
He could
I'm
stand
glad.
for several minutes at a
too.
time with the
Let's
support
keep
of
this.
forearm crutches.
We stand here today
He could take a
triumphant over
handful of
adversity.
steps across
This
a room
victory is
before his
ours.
legs grew too
Together.
tired to hold him. He still used the wheelchair for anything
Just like
beyond
you
short
running
distances,
Our
and he had
perfect
stopped
moment.
treating that fact as a tragedy. It was simply the shape of his life now, and he had built a peace with it that surprised even him some mornings. The contracting company had grown. Word of the housing foundation had spread further than Benedict ever anticipated, and several larger developers in the Charlotte area had begun partnering with his crew specifically because of the accessible design work his team had pioneered. Benedict found himself, almost without meaning to, becoming something of a quiet authority on building homes that worked for bodies like his own. He gave a talk at a regional builders conference that spring, his first time speaking publicly about the accident, and the room had gone completely silent during the parts where he described what those first months in the wheelchair had actually felt like, before recovering into applause that lasted longer than he was comfortable with. Ruby had left her hospital nursing position the year before to manage the Housing Foundation full-time, a decision that surprised people who knew how much she loved her pediatric patients. She told Benedict once, late at night on the porch, that she had spent years taking care of children who were sick through no fault of their own, and there was something that felt like an extension of that same purpose in building homes for veterans and families who had been failed by circumstances outside their control. Benedict had listened to her explain this and felt, not for the first time, a kind of quiet astonishment that this was the life he had ended up with. They had not planned to have children quickly. But 6 months into their marriage, Ruby found out she was pregnant, and the news landed in their small kitchen with a force that left them both standing at the counter laughing and crying at the same time. Their daughter, Adeline, was born the following winter, 3 weeks early but healthy, with a head of dark hair that the nurses joked looked like she had arrived ready for a photo shoot. Benedict held her for the first time sitting in his wheelchair in the hospital room, and Ruby took a photograph of that moment that she would later print and frame and hang in the hallway of their house, because she said it captured something about him that words never quite could. It was during Adeline's first birthday party, held at the lake cabin with a small group of friends and family scattered across the lawn, that Grace Lawson reappeared in their lives. Nobody had invited her. Nobody had expected her. She arrived in a car nobody recognized, parking at the edge of the gravel drive and standing beside it for a long moment before walking toward the gathering. Ruby saw her first. She had been carrying a plate of food across the lawn when she spotted her sister standing near the tree line, and the plate nearly slipped from her hands. 2 years had changed Grace. She looked thinner, and not in a way that suggested health. Her clothes, once meticulously chosen, looked like they had been put on without much thought. She stood at a distance, clearly unsure whether she was welcome, and for a long moment nobody moved toward her and nobody moved away. It was Benedict who eventually wheeled himself across the lawn toward her, because whatever had happened between them, whatever she had done, he had spent 2 years building a version of himself defined by something other than bitterness, and he was not interested in abandoning that now in front of his daughter's first birthday party. He stopped a few feet from her. She looked down at him, then seemed to catch herself, then crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level, a small gesture that told him something had genuinely shifted in her since the church. She said she was sorry to intrude. She said she had heard from a mutual friend that today was the party and she had driven 2 hours without fully deciding whether she would actually get out of the car when she arrived. What would you have done in that moment? If the person who humiliated you in front of 200 people, who calculated your worth based on your assets while you lay recovering from a catastrophic injury, showed up uninvited at your daughter's birthday, would you have asked her to leave? Would you have given her a chance to speak? I want you to sit with that question for a second, because what Benedict did next surprised almost everyone watching. He asked her if she wanted to walk with him along the edge of the lake. They moved slowly along the shoreline, Benedict in his wheelchair on the packed dirt path that his own crew had built 2 summers earlier specifically so he could navigate that part of the property without difficulty. Grace walked beside him in silence for a while before she began to speak. She told him that the year after the wedding had been the hardest of her life, and not because of the public humiliation of the viral video, though that had been brutal in its own way. It was harder, she said, because once the noise died down and the comments stopped coming, she had been left alone with the actual decision she had made, and she had been forced to look at it without anyone else's outrage to distract her from her own. She said she had gone to therapy, eventually, after losing the job in the new city and finding herself unable to explain to a new therapist why she felt like she had become a person she did not recognize. She said the therapist had asked her a question that she had not been able to answer for months. What exactly had she been afraid of losing the day she walked away from that altar? Benedict did not interrupt her. He had learned, in his recovery, the particular value of letting people finish difficult sentences without rescuing them from the silence in between. Grace said that eventually she had arrived at an answer, and it was not the answer she expected. She had not been afraid of becoming a caretaker, not really. She had been afraid of becoming invisible. She said that for her entire adult life, she had built her sense of worth around being seen, admired, chosen, envied a little. And when Benedict became paralyzed, she had panicked not because she didn't love him, but because she could not imagine a version of her future where the spotlight, even the small domestic spotlight of a happy marriage, would still find her. She said it sounded shallow saying it out loud, and it was shallow, and she had spent 2 years trying to become a person who was not built that way anymore. This is the part of the story I want you to think carefully about, because it is more honest than most people are willing to be about their own failures. How many of us have made choices, not because we stopped loving someone, but because we were afraid of what loving them through hardship would cost our own sense of who we are? Grace's confession was not an excuse. Benedict did not treat it as one. But it was, for the first time, something closer to the truth than anything she had told him before the wedding. He told her, standing at the edge of that lake, sitting, rather, in his wheelchair with the afternoon light coming through the trees, that he forgave her. Not because what she did was acceptable. Not because it hadn't cost him deeply. But because he had learned, in the slow and humbling process of rebuilding a body and a life, that carrying resentment for someone took up space that he wanted to use for something better. He told her he hoped she found whatever peace she was looking for. He told her she was welcome to stay for a slice of cake, if she wanted, but that she should understand the day belonged to his daughter and his wife, and he would not let anything disrupt that. Grace stayed for 20 minutes. She did not speak much to Ruby, and Ruby did not push for conversation either, though she did walk over near the end and say, simply, "I hope you are doing okay, Grace." It was the first time the two sisters had spoken more than a few clipped words to each other in 2 years, and something in Grace's face suggested that small kindness had cost her more composure than she expected to lose in front of strangers. She left before the cake was cut. She hugged her sister briefly at the car, an awkward, careful hug between two people relearning how to be around each other. She did not hug Benedict, but she shook his hand, and she told him that Adeline was beautiful and that he and Ruby had built something worth admiring. Then she got in her car and drove back the way she had come, and nobody at that party knew, in that moment, whether they would ever see her again. They would. but not for another year. The following spring brought a different kind of test for Benedict and Ruby, one that had nothing to do with Grace and everything to do with the slow, grinding reality of running a growing non-profit alongside a construction business while raising a toddler. The Housing Foundation had outgrown its original funding model. What had started as 12 units funded almost entirely through Benedict's restructured assets had become a waiting list of over 200 families and veterans across 3 counties, and the foundation simply did not have the capital to meet the demand. Ruby, who had thrown herself into the foundation's growth with an intensity that sometimes worried Benedict, began working with a grant writer to pursue state and federal funding for expanded accessible housing developments. It was unglamorous, exhausting work, applications that took weeks to prepare and were rejected in form letters within days, site visits from bureaucrats who asked the same skeptical questions about sustainability and asked them in slightly different words each time. There were nights that spring when Ruby came home from the foundation office and sat at the kitchen table without speaking for 20 minutes, simply staring at a stack of paperwork that represented 200 families who needed housing the foundation could not yet provide. It was during this period that Benedict did something that he had not told Ruby he was planning, something that revealed just how far he had traveled from the man who had once quietly restructured his estate in the shadow of a betrayal he hadn't spoken aloud. He had been approached, 6 months earlier, by a state housing commissioner who had heard him speak at the Builders Conference and had remembered the story, not the wedding, not the viral video, but the work. The commissioner asked if Benedict would consider serving on a newly formed state advisory board focused on accessible and affordable housing policy. Benedict had said he would think about it, mostly because public roles made him uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with his disability and everything to do with his natural inclination toward quiet, unglamorous work. But watching Ruby exhaust herself against the closed doors of grant applications that spring changed his mind. He called the commissioner back and accepted the position. And 6 weeks into his term on the board, he used his position, carefully, without overstepping, simply by being present in rooms where funding decisions were discussed, to advocate directly for a state matching grant program that could potentially double the foundation's capacity if they secured matching private funding. The night he came home and told Ruby what he had done, she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she put both hands over her face the way she had in the therapy room 2 years earlier, when he stood for 8 seconds on the parallel bars. When she lowered her hands, she was crying, and she told him that she had spent the last 6 weeks feeling like she was failing 200 families on her own, and she had not realized, until that exact moment, that she had not been carrying it alone at all. Ask yourself this: how often do the people who love us carry weight for us silently, in ways we do not notice until much later? How often have you assumed you were facing something alone, only to discover that someone had been working quietly behind the scenes the entire time? That is worth sitting with for a moment. Because Benedict never told Ruby what he was doing on that advisory board until it was finished, not because he wanted credit withheld, but because he had learned, perhaps from watching what hollow promises had once cost him, that the truest support is often the kind that doesn't announce itself. The matching grant came through that autumn. Combined with a private donor campaign that the foundation launched soon after, the funding allowed construction to begin on 31 new accessible housing units across 2 counties, more than doubling what the foundation had built in its first 2 years of existence. Ruby cried again the day the groundbreaking ceremony was held, standing beside Benedict on a plot of cleared red Carolina clay, surrounded by veterans and families who would eventually live in homes built specifically for bodies that the rest of the world too often forgot to design for. Grace returned to their lives the following winter, and this time, the circumstances were different in a way that none of them could have anticipated. She called Ruby directly, the first time she had reached out by phone rather than simply appearing somewhere, and asked if they could talk. Ruby, cautious but willing, agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near downtown Charlotte. What Grace told her that day was not a continuation of the apology tour that had begun at Adeline's birthday party. It was something more difficult. Grace had been diagnosed, several months earlier, with an early-stage but serious autoimmune condition that affected her mobility on bad days, leaving her sometimes unable to grip a coffee cup properly or walk more than a short distance without significant fatigue. She told Ruby this without asking for sympathy, in the flat, careful tone of someone who had rehearsed delivering difficult news many times in their head before finally saying it out loud to another person. She said the diagnosis had forced her, in a way that 2 years of therapy and self-reflection had not quite managed, to genuinely understand, physically, in her own body, what it might have felt like for Benedict in those early months after his accident. She said the universe had a particular sense of humor sometimes, giving people the exact education they had once failed to receive when it might have mattered most. She was not asking for money. She was not asking to be rescued. She told Ruby she had health insurance through her employer and a support system of friends in her new city. What she wanted, she said, was something much harder to ask for than financial help. She wanted to know if there was any possibility of being part of her sister's life again, and, by extension, part of her niece's life, not as a grand gesture of reconciliation, but slowly, carefully, in whatever way Ruby felt was safe. Ruby did not answer immediately. She told Grace she needed to think about it, and she needed to talk to Benedict, because whatever space Grace was asking to occupy again would inevitably touch his life and his daughter's life too, and that was not a decision Ruby felt she could make unilaterally. That night, Ruby told Benedict everything Grace had said. Benedict listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when Ruby finished, he sat quietly for a long time before responding. He told her that the decision about her sister belonged to her, not to him, and he would support whatever she decided. But he also told her something that surprised her, that he had thought, more than once over the past 2 years, about the particular cruelty of a world where people are rarely given the chance to be tested twice. Grace had failed her first test catastrophically and publicly. He said he did not know whether people deserved second chances by default, but he believed that genuine change, demonstrated consistently over time rather than performed in a single emotional moment, was worth taking seriously when it appeared. Ruby decided, over the following months, to let her sister back into her life slowly. There were dinners, awkward at first and gradually less so. There were phone calls. Grace came to visit on Adeline's 2nd birthday, and this time she had been invited. It was not a fairy tale reconciliation. There were moments where old resentment surfaced unexpectedly, conversations that ended more tensely than either sister intended. Grace's health condition worsened during a difficult stretch the following spring, and during that period, it was Ruby, and, in a development that surprised everyone including himself, Benedict, who drove her to several specialist appointments when her own support system in her new city proved thinner than she had let on. Benedict never mentioned the irony of the situation out loud, not once, though Ruby suspected he thought about it more than he admitted. What do you think it takes for a family to actually heal after something like this? Is forgiveness something that happens in a single conversation, or is it something rebuilt slowly, action by action, over years? I want you to think about your own family for a moment. Is there someone you have not forgiven, or someone who has not yet earned back your trust, who might be capable of more change than you have given them credit for? That is not a simple question, and I am not suggesting everyone deserves a second chance. But this story asks us to sit with the discomfort of that question rather than answering it too quickly. 3 years after the wedding that never happened, Benedict Washington actually stood, using a single forearm crutch rather than 2, a development his physical therapist had once told him was unlikely but not impossible, at the front of a state capitol building, delivering brief remarks at the opening of the Foundation's 40th completed housing unit. Ruby sat in the front row with Adeline, now 3 years old, on her lap, and beside her sat Grace, who had moved back to Charlotte the previous autumn after her health had stabilized enough to make the transition manageable, and who had slowly become, against every expectation anyone might have had 3 years earlier, a quiet and genuine presence in her niece's life. Benedict kept his remarks short, as he always did. He talked about the families who would move into the units behind him. He talked about the particular dignity of a home built for the body you actually have, rather than the body the world assumes you should have. He did not mention his own wedding, his own betrayal, his own years of rebuilding. He never did, in public settings. That story belonged to the people who had lived it, not to a podium. But afterward, walking slowly with his crutch across the gravel lot toward the car, with Ruby beside him and Adeline running small circles around both of them chasing a fallen leaf, Benedict said something to Ruby that she would think about for a long time afterward. He told her that he used to believe the accident was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He said he no longer believed that. He said the worst thing that happened to him was nearly believing, for those few terrible months after the wedding, that he was no longer worth staying for. And the best thing that happened to him, the genuinely best thing, was discovering, slowly, in 100 small unglamorous moments involving physical therapy exercises and dish towels and quiet conversations on a porch, exactly who had been telling him the truth the entire time. Ruby did not say anything in response. She simply reached over and took his free hand, and they walked the rest of the way to the car like that, in the particular quiet that exists between two people who no longer need many words to understand each other. So here is what I want to leave you with today. This story did not end with a villain punished and a hero rewarded in some clean, satisfying way that ties everything up with a bow. It ended somewhere much more honest than that, with forgiveness that was earned slowly rather than declared instantly, with a sister who chose loyalty over comfort and never once asked for credit for it, and with a man who learned that the people who truly love you are rarely the ones who promise the most. They are the ones who simply keep showing up, long after showing up has stopped being convenient. Tell me honestly in the comments, do you think Benedict was too generous in forgiving Grace, or do you believe people genuinely deserve the chance to change if they show it consistently over time? And for those of you who have a Ruby in your life, someone quiet, someone who shows up without asking for recognition, have you told that person recently how much they mean to you? Because stories like this remind us that the people who deserve our gratitude most are often the ones who never demand it. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that loyalty, real loyalty, is still out there. And if you have not yet watched part 1, the link is pinned in the comments below. Go watch it now if you haven't, because this story only means what it means when you've seen where it began. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. We will see you in the next one.